Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. All you holy apostles in heaven, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. For any of you who are going to be purchasing the DVD and audio format of these talks, this particular session will be a little bit different than the others, precisely because I had some technical difficulties when I was setting up. It just seems to be a theme over the past week. So this is not the first time in the last week. Something went out, so the recording will not be a direct audio. It will simply be the room noise being picked up from the camera. But at least we still have it. It won't be as good of a quality, but it'll still be there. So if you're interested in purchasing these talks, I just want to make a little note of that. Okay? And for anybody who purchases the audio or DVD. Okay, so here we are with lesson 2 of our seminar, the Narratio, which is Latin for narration. It's a narration of salvation history, a historical survey of salvation history from Genesis to Jesus. And last week's session, we focused on the creation account and the covenant that God enters into with creation and with Adam and Eve, and all of the details and all of the hints and the clues that reveal that truth to us. We looked at the so-called apparent contradiction between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, remember? And we answered that objection and showed that they do not contradict one another. In fact, they actually are focusing on 2 different aspects of the divine drama and the Father's plan and His creative work. Genesis 1, focusing on sort of the out there view, the panoramic view, right? Focusing on creation as a whole, focusing on God as the supreme being, the transcendent being, the creator of the whole entire cosmos. Genesis 2 is sort of the inner world focus. It zeroes in on creational day 6. So Genesis 2 is kind of like a commentary on further details about God's creative work on day 6, when God creates man and the animals, but God creates in particular the domestic animals and the domestic plants, and focuses on the garden, right? The inner sanctuary, so to speak, the macro temple. Recall that was another theme. We saw that the whole entire universe is like a macro temple that Adam is placed in to serve and to minister as priest. And we looked at all the various details for that. Tonight's session, we're going to focus on the fall of Adam and Eve, the original sin. And we're going to spend our whole 2 hours together looking at the fall narrative in the book of Genesis and the church's teaching about our fallen human nature, the consequences of that fall, etc. So I'm confident that tonight you'll find it very interesting in going through the narrative account. Some of the things you will already know, and I guarantee you there'll be a few little nuggets tonight that perhaps you don't know, and that tonight will be the first time you hear it. Hopefully it'll be interesting for you. Just as a brief outline, 3 major sections that we're going to cover tonight. Number 1, the fall of man. We're going to look at the historical value of the narrative of the fall. We'll look at the various details in the narrative itself. We'll look at some theological insights from the story, the effects of the fall, and the curses that come after the disobedient act of God. And then the second major section is what is known as the proto-evangelium. That's Latin for the first gospel, which is God's revelation of His plan of redemption right after the fall, revealed in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. So we're going to zero in on that, focus on that particular prophecy of Almighty God, where He begins to give us a hint of His plan of salvation. And then finally in section 3, it'll serve to be a bridge or a transition to the flood. and that is the tale of the righteous and the unrighteous. You might even say it's the great tale of the city of God and the city of man. And we'll look at this tale of righteous and unrighteous in the story itself in reference to Cain and Seth. You see, the two sons of Adam and Eve. So let's start off with the fall. As I mentioned already, we're going to divide the fall of man into 5 topics, looking at the historical value, the narrative details, theological insights from the story, the effects of the fall, and the covenant of curses. So let's start with the historical value of the fall narrative. The Catechism of the Catholic Church states in paragraph 390, quote, "The account of the fall in Genesis 3 uses figurative language, but affirms a primeval event, a deed that took place at the beginning of the history of man. Revelation gives us the certainty of faith that the whole of human history is marked by the original fault freely committed by our first parents," end quote. So there are a few things that I want us to highlight here, a few notes to take notice of. Note 1, notice how the Catechism affirms that figurative language is being employed in the fall narrative. As we saw last week, figurative language, symbolic language is used in the creation story, right? In the creation account. Is it a myth? No. Is it a legend? No. Is it a fiction? No. Pope Pius XII in 1950 in Humani Generis settled that debate. Although he did affirm that metaphorical language is employed in order to narrate certain primordial truths about God, man, and man's relation to God. The same is true for the fall narrative, as the Catechism points out here. Figurative language is being used. Now, it's kind of like poetry versus journalism, I guess you can say, right? Figurative language being used to communicate certain truths versus journalism, where somebody's going to recount events detail by detail at this particular time and this particular date, etc. What are some figures in the fall narrative or in the creation story itself as a whole? Well, first of all, the command to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Well, some scholars see that as a figure of a primordial truth that is man's limitation. The limitation of man's power to know good and evil. You see, man is not absolute. He is not the final arbiter of what is good and evil. Man's limited in his power to know good and evil. And so this tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a figure to represent man's limitation. That he is limited, God is not. God is absolute. God is the ultimate author, the fullness of knowledge, right? And so we participate in that knowledge. Another figure, obviously, is the serpent. Okay, a talking serpent, right? Well, that's a figure that's being used to represent whom? Satan, right? A real angelic person. We're going to get to this in a few moments. We're going to focus a little bit more on the talking serpent. But it's obvious that the author is using a figure here. Zoologists are not going to find a serpent that actually talks, okay? And then finally, the breathing into the nostrils, right? This is a figure, a poetic image that's being used to communicate the primordial truth that God has infused a material being, a material thing, that which comes from the material universe, with the spirit, right? The union of the spirit and the body. A primordial truth about the human being that's communicated through the figure of God breathing in the nostrils. So as the Catechism points out, figurative language is being used, and that's something we can affirm and accept as Catholics. However, note 2. Notice the Catechism's affirmation of a real historical event. Of a real historical event that took place at the dawn of the human race. So therefore, it's not a myth. It's not a fairy tale. Because a real event took place by our first two parents in disobeying God, as we're going to go through in a few minutes. If it was a myth, if it was a legend, if it was a fairy tale, well then it wouldn't be a real historical primordial event that took place. But the church is affirming that such an event did take place, thus it has real historical value to it. And finally, note 3. The original fault of Adam and Eve, which is what the Catechism is referencing, marked the whole of the human race and human history, as the Catechism affirms in paragraph 390. Now, if the original fall, if the creation story and the narrative of the fall was merely a myth, a legend, a fairy tale, fiction, pie in the sky, figment of the imagination, well then, how could the act of Adam and Eve affect all of human history? You see what I'm saying? And so the Catechism is affirming in 390, although allowing for the usage of figurative language, but nevertheless, truly historical in value, because it is affirming a real historical event by our first two, that involved our first two parents, and that actually marked and influenced and affected all of human history and all of humanity and the progeny of Adam and Eve. Okay? So, this is the church's position on the historical value of Genesis and the creation story, and as well as the narrative of the fall. Okay, so let's have some fun. Let's get into the narrative details of the fall. The first detail is the serpent. Let's talk about the serpent. And the first thing we need to know is the identity of the serpent. We all commonly know that the serpent's Satan, right? But how do we know that? You ever pondered that question? How do we know it's Satan? Because if you read carefully, the text of Genesis 3 never tells us it's the devil. It's Satan. So it's a very good question to ask and to answer. How do we know it's Satan? Well, we interpret Scripture in light of Scripture, looking at the Old in light of the New. And when we look to Revelation chapter 12, verse 9, when St. John has his heavenly vision of the portent in the sky, the woman clothed with the sun, the star, 12 stars, crown of 12 stars, the moon underneath her feet, and the great what? Dragon, right? And what does St. John tell us? He says, the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. So, although Genesis 3 doesn't tell us who the serpent is, we know both from the Jewish tradition and from our Christian tradition that that serpent was indeed the fallen angel Lucifer, the devil, Satan himself. And then also, too, in paragraphs 391 to 395 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the Catechism interprets this figure of the talking serpent in Genesis 3 as indeed Satan, the devil. So, that's the first thing to note. The identity of the serpent is indeed Satan. Now, we all knew that already, but I just kind of want to give you the background to that knowledge there. Okay, now here's where it gets really fun. Knowing, in light of the fact, let me just ask you all this. Do you recall when God tells Adam to keep and till the garden, right? Or till and keep the garden, and other translations would say, they say like command and care for the garden, etc. Well, in the Hebrew text, it's avodah and shamor. And that Hebrew word for to keep the garden is shamor, which literally can mean to guard the garden. So Adam receives a command to guard the garden. Now, think about it. Guard the garden from what? Obviously from some sort of evil threat, correct? And who might that evil threat be? Well, obviously we know Satan. Have you ever wondered, why did Adam let Satan in the garden? If Adam was supposed to guard the garden from this evil threat, namely the devil, Satan, why did he let him in? Why didn't he keep him out? And I think this is an interesting question to pondered, and many biblical scholars have pondered it, and they offer a possible answer to this question. And that is, we have to see this talking serpent in a way that perhaps Adam would have seen the serpent. We sort of have this storybook imagery, right? Of this little innocent, non-threatening, slithery serpent, coming to Adam. But in fact, when we look at the Hebrew text, we get an indication that perhaps Adam would not have visibly perceived an innocent, non-threatening, slithery serpent, but something else. And so the second thing to note here, our second note in this detail of the serpent, is the appearance of the serpent. The Hebrew word for the serpent is nahash, which can be translated as serpent, but serpent in the Jewish tradition refers to a ferocious beast. Not a thin little slithering snake, but a ferocious beast. For example, in Isaiah chapter 27, verse 1, we read about the great sea serpent, Leviathan. In that day the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. In the Hebrew version of Isaiah 27:1, it's Nahash. In the Greek translation of that Old Testament text, it's Ophis. Now that's going to be important in a few minutes. Leviathan, the twisting serpent, the text goes on. Once again, Hebrew, Nahash. And he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. So notice how this Hebrew word Nahash, serpent, in the Jewish tradition is associated with this great ferocious dragon from the sea. To further that evidence, we go back to Revelation chapter 12, verse 9, where St. John describes the dragon, right, as that ancient serpent. St. John says the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. The Greek word for serpent in John's account here in Revelation 12:9 is ophis. That's the same Greek word that's used in the Greek version of Isaiah when he's talking about the great sea serpent Leviathan. And it's the same Greek word used in the Greek version of Genesis chapter 3 in reference to the serpent, the devil. You see? And so, in both the Jewish and Christian tradition, the word that is used to describe the devil in the garden is associated with the great sea dragon-type ferocious creature. And so in light of that, we make an interpretive application, and we have a possible rationale for Adam's failure to guard the garden. Satan possibly appeared to Adam in a life-threatening manner. And Adam cowered in guarding the garden because of this ferocious beast that appeared to him. Now, this fits perfectly with what we know about angelology and demonology, right? Pure spiritual beings, both righteous and unrighteous, can appear to our visible perception, our sensory perception, in any form or manner they wish. To our sight, they can appear as they wish. They can manipulate the sense of smell, the sense of hearing. They have access to our sensory perceptions. And they can manipulate that and appear to us in any different shape or form. Remember, St. Paul says that the devil could appear as an angel of light, right? And so we see that angelic beings, righteous or unrighteous, can visibly manifest themselves in ways that they want. And so it fits perfect with the clues in the narrative that would suggest Satan's appearing not as a non-threatening, slithery serpent, but as a ferocious beast. Thus giving a possible rationale for Adam's failure to guard the garden. Okay, the second detail that we can reflect upon in this narrative of the fall, and that is the manipulation of Satan. Satan shows us that he is the master manipulator. The first part of his manipulation is the questioning of God's prohibition. We read in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1, quote, "Did God say, 'You shall not eat of any tree of the garden'?" I'm going to repeat that. Did God say, "You shall not eat of any tree in the garden"? Where's the manipulation there? Can you catch it? Notice how Satan is saying, did God say you can't eat from any tree? Did God say they can't eat from any tree? No, God said just not this tree, right? So what's the interpretive application here? Well, it seems as if Satan is trying to make God's law seem arbitrary and tyrannical. Think about it. Satan's trying to get Eve to think, well, wait a minute. God, we have all these trees that we can eat from. But God says just this one we can't eat from. God could have picked anyone, but he picks this one. Seems a bit arbitrary, right? Just by the whim of my pants, I'll pick that tree, right? And so it seems as if Satan is trying to get Eve to see God's law as arbitrary, and God is like this some sort of omnipotent tyrant. And there's actually a hint in the narrative that suggests Eve bites the bait. And Eve succumbs to the manipulation. Because in Genesis 3:3, here's what Eve says. Yeah, and God said too, "Neither shall you touch it, lest you die." Did God ever say that? No. God never said, "Lest you touch it, you shall die." So it's almost as if Eve is exaggerating the command, right? She's buying into this manipulation that God's law is arbitrary and tyrannical and pointless. And so in other words, Eve is like, yeah, God said we can't even touch the darn thing. You see? And so Eve is biting the bait of Satan's manipulation. So that's the first part. The second part of Satan's manipulation is the questioning of God's warning about death. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 4, remember Satan tells Eve, he says, "Surely, if you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil," which remember God said not to, "surely you will not die." Right? So Satan's questioning, because remember, God said, if you eat, you will die. Satan comes and says, if you eat, you won't die. He's testing God's command, right? He's questioning God's warning. Now, what's interesting is that Adam and Eve eat of the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, and they don't die. But God said they would die. Is Satan right? Well, partially. If we look at the natural level, they didn't drop dead physically. Because when Satan says, surely you will not die, it's possible that he would be referring to natural death, you see. Oh, surely you won't die physically, naturally, right this minute. And so, what about God's warning? What about God's promise? If you eat, you're going to die. Well, Adam and Eve, my dear friends, although they don't drop dead physically, naturally, right there, they do indeed die. And that is the spiritual death, the supernatural death of the supernatural life. Because what's interesting is that in the Hebrew text, when God warns Adam and Eve to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, lest they die, God says, you will die. There's a double repetition there in the Hebrew text, which scholars point out that according in the Hebrew language, they didn't have the superlative, right, of like good, best, good, better, best, or good, better, greatest type of thing. And so in order to suggest or indicate degrees of greatness, they would employ repetition. Think of holy, 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 right? God is the greatest in the category of holiness. And so for God to say you will die, that indicates you will die the greatest death, which is the death of the supernatural life in the soul, which is far greater in value than even our natural life. And so we see this manipulation of Satan. Satan's referring to the natural level. God refers to the supernatural level. Now, obviously, eventually, Adam and Eve would indeed die physically.
had they not sinned, they would not have died. But we see Satan playing this manipulative game here. Finally, the third part of Satan's manipulation is the assertion that God doesn't want Adam and Eve to be like him. In Genesis 3:5, Satan says, "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil," end quote. Now, friends, what's the irony here? Well, think about it. Adam and Eve were already made in the image and likeness of God. And so Satan is lying here. He is the father of lies. He's saying God doesn't want you to be like him. Hogwash. He just told us he made Adam and Eve in his own likeness. You see? And so Satan is manipulating. He's lying. He's twisting and trying to get Adam and Eve to think that God is this sort of selfish tyrant, right? Wants all the power for himself, doesn't want to share anything, keep everything for himself. And so Satan gets Adam and Eve to forget about that fundamental truth, that God had already made them in his image and likeness. Detail number 3 of the narrative of the fall. Satan's death threat. You will not die. It's suggested by some biblical scholars, in particular Dr. Scott Hahn has written a lot about this. He's a leading biblical scholar and theologian in the Church of America today. And when Satan is talking to Eve here, and as I'm going to suggest in a few moments, Adam as well, when he says, "Surely if you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, surely you will not die." So in other words, if you disobey God's command, you will not die. Some scholars see an implication in that as a death threat. As if Satan is threatening Adam and Eve in the sense of, if you disobey God, you won't die. I'll spare your life. In other words, if you don't disobey God, I'll kill you. Let me kind of take the logic and put it in another scene, an example, to try to flesh it out. Let's say I get taken by the Roman guards because I'm a Christian, right, in the 1st century, and I'm brought before Nero. And Nero says, "Carlo, deny Jesus Christ as your God, and surely you will not die." Jesus is God. Boom, I'm dead, right? So you see the implication? Carlo, deny Jesus Christ, surely you will not die. What's the flip side of the coin? If you don't deny Jesus, I'm going to kill you. Satan speaking to Adam and Eve, you eat of the tree, disobey God, surely you will not die. What's the flip side of the coin? If you don't eat, if you don't disobey, if you don't deny God, I'm going to kill you. Which seems to fit with Satan appearing to them as this great, ferocious, life-threatening beast, right? So Adam, already cowered by letting the ferocious beast, the Nahash, into the garden, now the Nahash is verbally threatening his life, and Adam still doesn't do a thing. Dr. Scott Hahn points out how there's a clue in the New Testament that possibly affirms this interpretation of the death threat in the narrative. In Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 through 15, we read the following. The author of Hebrews says, quote, "Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same nature, that through death he might destroy him who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong bondage," end quote. And scholars see in this statement that through fear of death possibly could be applied to Adam. Through his fear of death, all of humanity was subject to a lifelong bondage to the devil. But Jesus comes and delivers us from that bondage and that domination of the devil who has the power of death. So we see a possible clue here to make the connection and affirm this interpretation that Satan was threatening the very life of Adam and Eve. And consequently, they failed to obey God because of this threat. Detail number 4 of the narrative to take into consideration. The 3 sources of temptation. Scholars see that there are 3 possible sources of temptations in the Genesis account. In Genesis 3:5, you will be like God. There's a temptation, there's a source of temptation. Number 2, Genesis 3:6, the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil was good for food. And then number 3, it was a delight to the eyes. Now what's interesting is that these 3 sources of temptation correspond to what our Catholic tradition refers to as the threefold concupiscence, or the threefold lust that's explicated by St. John the Evangelist in 1 John chapter 2, verse 16, when he speaks of the pride of life, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes. Those 3 forms of lust, or those 3 areas of concupiscence, temptation, etc., match up perfectly with the genitive narrative. So you will be like God, that temptation, that source of temptation, matches up with the pride of life, which the Catechism in paragraph 377 comments that that is associated with self-assertion, right? To assert self over and above and before God and before others. The second source of temptation, it was good for food. That seems to correlate with the lust of the flesh, which has to do, according to the Catechism, with sensory pleasures, you see. And so it was good for food. That is, it was appealing to the senses of Adam and Eve, to the sensory appetites. And then finally, it was a delight to the eyes, which seems to correspond with St. John's lust of the eyes, which the Catechism says refers to material possessions. Now, how can lust of the eyes be associated with material possessions? Because when I see it, I want to possess it. You see? Now, notice how these sources of temptations and the threefold concupiscence matches perfect with what is commonly referred to as the unholy Trinity, right? And I repeat, the unholy Trinity: power, sex, money. Power associated with the pride of life. You will be like God. Sex associated with the lust of the flesh and sensory pleasures. It was good for food. Money associated with the lust of the eyes and material possession. It was a delight to the eyes. You see? So we see this connection between all 3. Now, I could have added another column in here. Anybody know of the 3 evangelical counsels? Poverty, chastity, and obedience, right? Those 3 evangelical counsels, these are vows that the religious take. Nuns who are in the convents, sisters who are outside of the convent, working in the world, brothers, religious life, etc. And so obedience would be that evangelical counsel that remedies the pride of life. Right? Chastity, the evangelical counsel that remedies the lust of the flesh. Poverty, the evangelical counsel that remedies the lust of the eyes and material possessions. So we see this interconnection between these things. So this is an interesting detail in the narrative, I think, that is important for us to draw out. The 5th detail. Adam was with Eve while Satan was tempting. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, we get a hint, which it's important to note that it comes right after the dialogue with Satan and Eve. So before Genesis 3:6, Satan's dialoguing with Eve, and then right in verse 6 we read this. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise and to be like God, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband, and he ate. You see the implication there? So Satan's talking to Eve. We don't hear Adam. But then all of a sudden she takes of the fruit, gives it to her husband, implying that he is right there next to Eve when all of this manipulation stuff is taking place. And so the note to draw out here is that the beginning of the fall seems to be Adam's failure not only to guard the garden, but to guard his wife, Eve. Right? My dear friends, as this ferocious beast is conversing with his bride, he is standing right there silent and doesn't do a thing to stand in between the evil threat and his bride. He fails to live up to his manhood, to be the guardian, to be the protector. Talk about a sermon and a half for that one, huh? We could go all day on that and run with it, but it's a profound truth. So we see that the beginning of sin, that which begins to lead to sin, is this cowardice, this failure to live up to his vocation to be the guardian. And it seems to make sense out of St. Paul's focus on Adam and never Eve. You ever wondered that? In Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 14, he talks about how through one man's disobedience came death. Through another man's obedience comes life. That is Jesus, right? Jesus being the new Adam. Why doesn't Paul ever talk about Eve? You know, we always tend to think, oh, it's Eve's fault, right? You know, we joke about that in catechism class and Bible studies and stuff like that. But in reality, au contraire, folks. Eve, yeah, she sinned, but only because her husband led her into the sin. Only because her husband. Now, obviously, she has free will. She chose.
It's always the husband's fault.
That's right. That's right. Well, that choice was influenced by her husband's failure to lead her in obedience to the Father's plan of happiness. And oh, how often in modernity, the modern man in the home, how often he fails to lead his bride and his family in obedience to the Father's plan of happiness for his human family and for salvation. And all of the, you know, back in Louisiana, we used to say the tracas, all of the mess, all of the trouble, all of the bad stuff in the world, it could actually be traced and rooted in man's failure to guard the home, to guard the garden, to stand in between the ferocious beast, the Nahash, and his bride, Eve, and his family. You see? I mean, profound truth there. So, ladies, it's the man's fault, I'm telling you. But I'm trying to make up for it, right? Thanks, family. See, now check this out. Think about this. What is this pointing us toward? This is the Narratio. We're reading the New in light of the Old. We're looking at salvation history, right? Why do you think Jesus is going to have to come as the new Adam and go all the way to the cross and die? I mean, because Jesus just could have snapped his fingers and willed it, and man, the human race would have been redeemed. Why did Jesus have to go all the way to the death and give himself totally in sacrificial love? Because the first Adam failed to do so. The first Adam failed to be a martyr. The first Adam failed to lay down his life for his bride Eve in the face of the Nahash. So the new Adam comes and makes right with the old Adam disorder. The new Adam comes and does what the first Adam should have done, and that is he lays down his life and self-sacrificial love for whom? His bride, the church, folks. You see that connection there? So you see how this detail of the narrative of the fall actually sheds light on the whole rest of salvation history. and in particular, the very sacrificial act of Jesus Christ. Okay, so hopefully that was inspiring for you. I don't know about you, but that's fun Bible study. Topic number 3, the theological insights from the story. And the major theological insight is Adam fell in covenantal love. Recall, last week, in the creation account, what was the major theme? The seventh-day rest? Covenant, right? God entering into a covenant with creation. God entering into a covenant with Adam and Eve. It's a covenantal relationship, which basically means a sacred family bond, right? Covenant. To make a covenant means to bring two parties into a familial relationship that is sacred, sealed by an oath, calling upon the name of God, etc. So, what is covenantal love? Well, the nature of covenantal love is sacrificial love. The total gift of self. Because you may wonder, you may think, well, why did God put Adam to this test? I mean, God could have kept the Nahash out the picture. Why did God let the Nahash go and approach Adam as he's standing guard of the garden? Why did God allow that? Well, he's testing Adam. He's putting Adam to a test of love. And because they've entered into a covenantal relationship, God is giving Adam an opportunity to show his love to God by laying down his life in self-sacrificial love, which is the very nature of covenantal love, you see? Familial love. That's the kind of love for relationship. Yeah?
But at that point, could Adam actually die?
Well, yeah, by nature, okay? By nature, he is ordered to, the material body is ordered to death by nature. The fact that Adam would not die was a special grace, you might say, a blessing that God promised to preserve them from that natural end of the body, you see? And so by nature he could have died. And Adam would have had that self-awareness of the possibility of mortality due to the nature of the body, etc. And so he experiences a natural human emotion of fear, right? And so even though he had, because some people might say, well, he had a perfect human nature, how could he fail, right? Well, just because you have a perfect human nature doesn't mean you're not going to experience fear. Because fear is a natural emotion of human nature, embedded within the very fabric of our being. God created us with that. But see, where Adam fails is that he fails to use his intellect and will to rightfully order the fear. And to overcome the fear, and we're going to look at this in a minute, we're going to put it in 3 points. He failed to overcome the fear in obedience to God. You see, obedience to God was greater than preservation of own life. So we're going to get to that in just a minute, and it'll kind of flesh it out for you, hopefully. Okay, so the nature of covenantal love is sacrificial love. Now, this is important because note, all throughout salvation history, whenever a covenant is made, guess what? There has to be sacrifice. And sacrifice, all throughout salvation history, is basically like the sacrifice of animals and stuff. It's the very nature of that is that it is meant to be a symbolic offering of the individual who's making the sacrifice. So the animal symbolizes, the offering of the animal symbolizes the offering of the person and his or her fidelity of love to God. And so, well, if this is a covenant in the garden that God is making with Adam and Eve, what is necessary? Sacrifice. What's the sacrifice? Adam is called to be the sacrificial victim. That's some interesting terminology. Who might that remind you of? Christ, the ultimate sacrificial victim for what? The new and everlasting covenant. Adam was called to be the sacrificial victim for that first covenant, but he failed to offer himself in covenantal love. So this seems to be the major theological insight, the major theme. So, excuse me, here's a summary of the elements of Adam's failure in covenantal love. Number one, out of fear of losing his own life, Adam failed to sacrifice himself in love by not protecting the garden and Eve from the ferocious beast. Right? So out of fear of losing his own life, out of fear of death, he doesn't adhere to the command to guard the garden and Eve. Out of fear of death, out of fear of losing his own life, Adam failed to sacrifice himself in obedience to God's command. So we have a failure to protect, we have a lack of obedience because of the fear of death, and then finally, out of fear of losing his natural life, Adam failed to sacrifice himself to protect his supernatural life within his soul, which is the very thing that gave him divine sonship with God. Because one thing that, if you recall from last week, when we were talking about the anthropological truths about man from the creation story, which means truths about the human being, we discovered that Adam was created in divine sonship with God, an adoptive familial relationship with God the Father, right? Because remember, it says he's created in image and likeness. That phraseology in the Jewish tradition means sonship. See? Familial relationship. So Adam is created in a familial covenantal relationship with God, which means Adam was created with God's life in the soul, sanctifying grace, which gave him adoptive sonship with the Father. And so Adam chooses the natural life. He preserves his natural life at the expense of forfeiting what? His supernatural. You see, God was calling Adam. He was testing Adam to see what God already knows, but for Adam to know, what does Adam value most? You see? Does Adam value the natural life or the supernatural life? Was it bad to value the natural life? No. But whenever the natural life is put first, over and above and supreme to the supernatural life, we got it disordered, folks. And so, if God's going to put Adam to the test, in order for Adam to come to where to see what does he value, where is his treasure? You see? Is it the natural life or is it the supernatural life? Remember, is it day 6 or is it day 7? If God did that to Adam, then guess what, folks? This is a profound truth for us. God's going to allow us to go through certain tests. How about this? Deliver us, Lord, from every, in the Our Father. I'm trying to think of the Lord. Thank you! I was having a brain freeze. Lead us not into temptation. Well, the original translation is lead us not into the test, right? So we're asking God, hey, God, take it easy on us, right? Because God often God will allow us to go through certain tests in order for us to see where our heart is. Do we really value the supernatural life, relationship with God, heaven, day 7? Or do we value more the natural life, day 6? You see? So we're going to go through tests sometimes. So these are profound truths to call to mind. Third point to make here. Adam sets the pattern of failure in covenantal love. This is something that's interesting in the narrative. So you have Adam, the first covenantal mediator, who fails in covenantal love. And then the rest of the narrative, remember those 6 major covenants? We said Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David. Remember that? Well, guess what? All of those major figures follow suit with Adam's failure in covenantal love. So, the next major figure in salvation history is Noah, right? Well, guess what? Noah does the same thing as Adam. He fails in covenantal love. He gets drunk. Abraham took a concubine because he didn't trust in God's promise. He didn't trust God's plan. The next major figure, Moses. He fails in covenantal love. Moses loses his temper in the desert and disobeys God. Remember that? God said, strike the rock. Moses spoke to the rock the second time around. Consequently, guess what? He couldn't go into the promised land. Right? And then Israel talk about a little bit, we're seen as the firstborn son of God. And we're identified as a God related to the whole of the people of Israel as like a single son. And Israel fails in covenantal love because they worship the golden calf. David commits adultery with Bathsheba, right? So we see how Adam's failure in covenantal love sets this pattern of all of the covenantal mediators throughout salvation history failing over and over again in covenantal love and self-sacrificial love. And so what does it require? It requires a covenantal mediator to come and not fail and break the pattern of failure. And who is that? Jesus Christ. Jesus comes, does not fail, and shows us what is true covenantal love and breaks this pattern. Okay, let me see where I'm at here and try to decide where we're going to take a break. Let's go ahead and pause right here. We have some refreshments in the back. When we come back in a few minutes, we'll take a little short break. And then when we come back, we're going to pick up with the effects of the fall. Okay? And so we'll get some goodies, come back fairly briefly because I don't think I got where I needed to get for the break time. Okay? God bless you.